The morning Richard Hastings announced his revolutionary vision, the Oakmont Estates Community Center was packed shoulder to shoulder with neighbors. Richard stood at the podium like he was about to reveal the cure for cancer. Not a suburban engineering project. The Willowbrook Creek, he began, his voice carrying that particular cadence of someone accustomed to being heard and believed, is a liability. It's beautiful, yes, but it's unpredictable. And unpredictable means uncontrolled real estate risk. Sarah Chen sat in the third row, her coffee growing cold. She'd lived on Oakmont Drive for 12 years, long enough to know Richard's rhetoric. He'd been HOA president for 4 of those years, and in that time he'd engineered strict landscaping codes, installed security gates at both entrances, and changed the community's bylaws to require board approval for exterior paint colors. Everything had a logic to it, for the good of property values. But Sarah had noticed something. Richard's house had appreciated faster than anyone else's. The creek meanders through 3 properties prone to flooding, Richard continued, clicking to a slide. Last spring, the Martinez family had 3 inches of water in their basement. What if it happens again? What if someone gets hurt? And what happens to property values when homes have water damage histories? Richard paused, letting that sink in. He was good at pauses. What I'm proposing is controlled water management. A retention dam, positioned here, he pointed to a spot where the creek narrowed significantly before flowing through the residential area, would prevent future flooding. We'd even create a small retention pond, enhanced landscaping, birds, maybe some benches. It would become an asset. A selling point, the room murmured. Richard smiled. He'd done it, reframed a massive structural intervention as neighborhood improvement. Marcus Webb, sitting 2 rows back, leaned over to his wife. He's going to do this regardless of what we think, isn't he? His wife, Janet, squeezed his hand. He already has the votes. She was right. Richard had called ahead, strategically placed phone calls to board members, and had his friend Gerald on the planning committee. The meeting, despite looking like a community forum, was theater. The decision had been made weeks ago. When the vote came, a simple voice vote, deliberately informal, the ayes seemed to carry more weight than the nays. Richard's face relaxed into a satisfied smile. Excellent, he said. I've already secured the contractor. We break ground in 2 weeks. Sarah stayed late, approaching Richard as he was packing up his laptop. Richard, have you had the environmental impact assessed? The creek is protected under state regulations and all handled, he said smoothly, not even looking at her. Got special permits. One of my tenants is a city planner. Strings were pulled, sure, but nothing improper. Everything's legal. Legal isn't the same as right, Sarah said quietly. Richard did look at her then, and his expression was almost pitying. Sarah, I appreciate your passion for nature. I do. But we're talking about protecting homes, protecting families. That's what matters. She walked out into the cool April evening, her stomach tight with certainty. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew something was. The construction crew arrived on a Monday morning with heavy equipment that looked like it could level mountains. Richard had made arrangements for them to stage everything at his own property, the largest lot in Oakmont, which only reinforced the narrative, that he was willing to bear the inconvenience for the neighborhood's benefit. He'd made sure the HOA newsletter ran a photo of him shaking hands with the project manager. For 3 weeks, the sound of excavation filled the air. Dump trucks rumbled through residential streets. A culvert was installed. Concrete was poured. Sarah watched from her yard as the creek, the same creek her daughter had caught tadpoles in, the same creek that had provided the neighborhood's only real natural beauty, was systematically rerouted. By the 4th week, the dam was complete. It was actually well-engineered, Sarah had to admit, professional. The retention pond filled naturally, creating an almost lake-like feature. And Richard had followed through on the landscaping. Willows planted around the perimeter, a small stone bench facing the water. From a certain angle, it looked intentional, planned, but something was wrong. Sarah noticed it first, the water level rising. The retention pond was filling too quickly, fed not just by the creek but by what looked like groundwater seepage from the surrounding properties. The dam's design, perfect in theory, hadn't accounted for the geological reality of Oakmont Hills. The area sat on a spring-fed aquifer. Richard's concrete barrier was disrupting centuries of natural water flow. She called Richard on a Thursday. "The pond," she said. "How deep is it supposed to be?" "About 6 feet maximum," he said, distracted. "Why?" "It's already deeper than that. I measured this morning. It's at 7 feet and rising. And it's getting murky." "Richard, I think there's a geological issue. Sarah, you're not a hydrologist." The engineers signed off. "The system is working fine." "The system is failing," she said, but he'd already hung up. By the second week of May, the problem was impossible to ignore. The retention pond had risen another 2 feet and was beginning to overflow at its far edge, right onto the property behind it, which happened to be the Martinez family's home. Elena Martinez called an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was even more packed this time, but the atmosphere was different. Angry, frightened. "It's flooding," Elena's voice cracked. "My garage flooded last night. There's water in my basement again, worse than last year." "We thought we were paying for the solution." Richard stood, composed. "The system is functioning as designed. Excess water is being directed into my home," Elena interrupted. "Richard, this is my family's house. We have a daughter with asthma. The water damage, the mold, the moisture, this is dangerous." "We'll adjust the spillway," Richard said calmly, as if the solution was obvious. "It's a minor calibration." "Nothing about this is minor," Marcus Webb stood. "My property value is tanking. We just got our assessment and we've dropped $40,000. My wife wants to sell. We can't sell. We're trapped." The meeting descended into chaos. People shouting, crying. Richard stood at the podium looking like a man watching a simple math problem become increasingly complex. By the time Sarah left, it was clear. The dam hadn't solved a problem. It had created one. And worse, Richard had no plan to fix it. The first attorney showed up on a Tuesday morning with a notice of intent to sue. By Friday, there were 3 lawsuits filed against the HOA. By the following Monday, a hydrological engineer Richard hadn't hired was conducting an independent assessment, paid for by a coalition of neighbors who'd pooled money. Sarah sat in her kitchen reading the preliminary findings, her hands shaking. The dam had disrupted the natural groundwater flow across 8 properties. The retention pond's water level was continuing to rise at an unpredictable rate, currently at 9.2 feet, with projections suggesting it could reach 11 feet before stabilizing. The report included a technical term that made Sarah's blood run cold: subsidence risk. The weight of the water was causing the surrounding earth to settle unevenly. In simpler terms, foundations were shifting. The Martinez family discovered cracks in their basement walls, small now but growing. The structural engineer they hired issued a dire assessment. If the water level continued climbing, the damage could become catastrophic. Richard called an emergency board meeting, but this time he wasn't the one in control. 2 board members who'd voted for the dam had already received their own hydrological reports. "They look sick. We need to drain it," Gerald said flatly, abandoning Richard without hesitation. "Immediately. And we need to engage an environmental firm to undo this." "Drain it?" Richard's voice had lost its smooth confidence. "We can't just drain 8 million gallons of water. Where does it go?" "That's your problem," said Jennifer Huang, the board secretary. "You did this. You pushed this through without proper environmental review. You knew someone at the city who expedited permits. Now we're paying for your shortcuts." "I was trying to help," Richard said, and Sarah heard something genuine crack through for the first time. But it was too late for genuine. The next morning, Richard issued a statement. "Due to unexpected geological conditions, I believe the dam requires additional engineering assessment. I'm stepping down as HOA president, effective immediately, to focus on working with environmental firms to find the best solution forward." Translation: "I'm running, but running was harder than he thought." The media picked up the story. Local news showed up with cameras. "Suburban HOA President's Vision Turns Neighborhood into Environmental Disaster," one headline read. Another, "One Man's Home Values Dream Becomes 8 Families' Nightmare." Richard's house went on the market 3 days later. He listed it at asking price, but nobody was interested. A house on the edge of a destabilizing retention pond backed by failed engineering wasn't a selling point. By June, the situation had become a perfect storm of consequences. The legal discovery process revealed something damning. Emails showing Richard pressuring the city planner, who happened to be his tenant, to expedite the permits without the full environmental review typically required. It wasn't technically illegal, but it was ethically rotten. The news outlets didn't hesitate to characterize it as corrupt. The HOA insurance company, reviewing what had happened, determined that Richard's decisions constituted gross negligence rather than reasonable engineering judgment. They refused to cover the damages. That meant the HOA itself, the entire neighborhood, was liable. Special HOA assessments totaling $340,000 were proposed to cover the initial legal fees, engineering remediation, and the Martinez family's emergency structural repairs. Sarah received notice of her portion, $4,200. She sat on her porch, the bill in her hands, feeling something like despair. "We didn't want this," she said to Marcus, who'd come over to commiserate. "We tried to stop it." "Doesn't matter," Marcus said bitterly. "The majority voted. We're all paying. But worse than the financial ruin was the social fallout." Richard had become toxic. His name was in the neighborhood Facebook group multiple times a day, each mention accompanied by fresh anger. People who'd been his friends 3 months ago now crossed streets to avoid him. His wife, Linda, became a figure of sympathy and shame simultaneously. People pitied her for being married to him, while also resenting her for benefiting from his decisions. Richard stayed in his house, the same house that wouldn't sell and became a ghost. His daughter had transferred to a private school. His wife barely left home. He'd become the neighborhood's public villain, a role he couldn't escape. But the retention pond remained, and it continued to haunt everyone. The environmental firm hired to assess remediation options recommended a staged drainage process over 6 months to avoid sudden flooding downstream, combined with extensive groundwater monitoring. The cost estimate came back at $890,000, another special assessment. This time, $6,800 per household. Sarah, lying in bed at night, felt the weight of it. Her retirement timeline had shifted. Her daughter's college fund had been tapped. And the creek, the beautiful natural creek, was gone forever, replaced by a concrete monument to one man's hubris. The drainage process began in July. Engineers had designed a series of relief channels to redirect excess water downstream, away from the residential properties. For 6 weeks, the neighborhood held its breath, watching as water levels began their slow descent. It was during this period that Sarah discovered something. She was doing her own research into the history of the creek, looking at old property records and geological surveys. What she found was stunning. The Willowbrook Creek had been diverted once before, in 1987, by a previous developer who'd built the first commercial district downtown. The creek's natural flow had been dramatically altered, and the groundwater patterns had been compensating for decades. Richard's Dam hadn't just disrupted water flow, it had collided with a pre-existing geological anomaly. His engineers should have discovered this in proper environmental review. They probably would have, if the permits hadn't been expedited. Sarah brought her findings to the attorney representing the neighbors. It strengthened their case significantly. It suggested that Richard's negligence wasn't just poor engineering judgment. It was predictable. Preventable negligence that could have been avoided through proper process. By August, Richard Hastings' life had become a legal minefield. He was being sued personally by 3 families. The city was investigating the permit irregularities. The neighborhood association had removed him from any authority and was pursuing recovery of his consulting fees. His insurance company had hired investigators to document his awareness of the geological risks. But then something unexpected happened. Richard's wife, Linda, filed for divorce. The court proceedings, public record, revealed that Richard had taken out a substantial personal loan against the house in anticipation of the dam project generating consulting fees. He'd been planning to profit from the remediation contract as well. Linda, discovering this, had decided she was done. It was the detail that turned public pity into public scorn. He wasn't a visionary who'd made an honest mistake. He was a con artist who'd gambled with the neighborhood's stability for his own gain. Part 6. After by December, the retention pond was draining. The water level had dropped to manageable heights. The stone benches Richard had installed sat beside shrinking water, a monument to good intentions paved with disaster. The Martinez family hired structural engineers to assess the damage. The basement cracks were being injected with epoxy. The foundation, while compromised, was salvageable. The repairs would cost $67,000. The HOA special assessment covered half. Elena Martinez spent nights awake anyway, listening for new sounds of settling, new evidence of structural failure. The neighborhood had changed. Trust, once broken, never quite solidified back into its original form. Board meetings were tense, procedural, nothing like the friendly gatherings they'd once been. People voted based on suspicion rather than goodwill. Richard's house finally sold in October to an investor who purchased it at a substantial loss, planning to rent it out. Richard had moved to another state to start over, though his name followed him through internet searches and news archives. He was the HOA president who dammed the creek. That was his epitaph now. Sarah stood on her porch one cold December morning, watching the creek bed as drainage continued. The creek itself would return eventually. The downstream channels being established would naturally catch and redirect the flow that had been blocked. It would take time, but the water always found a way. Her daughter, home from college for winter break, joined her on the porch. "Do you think he knew?" her daughter asked. "Like deep down that it would go wrong?" Sarah considered this. "I think he convinced himself it couldn't. There's a kind of certainty people get when they're invested in their own vision. They see what they want to see. That's scary," her daughter said. "It is?" Sarah agreed. "Because it means it could happen again. Different person, different project, same certainty, same blindness." The drainage pumps hummed in the distance. The emergency was over, but the scars remained, visible in the cracked driveway of the Martinez home. In the foreclosure auction, notices for 2 properties whose owners couldn't survive the special assessments. In the careful distance neighbors maintained from one another at community events. Richard Hastings had tried to protect home values. Instead, he'd destroyed them, the real estate values. Yes, but also the social value of trust, the currency of community, the assumption that your neighbors had your interests at heart. The creek would recover. Neighborhoods are more resilient than people. But the lesson remained, carved as deeply into Oakmont estates as the concrete dam had carved into the earth. Vision without wisdom is just expensive chaos, and someone always has to pay for it.